A ruined name, a daughter sold, a man once mocked now waits at the altar, not to punish but to protect. In a city perfumed with magnolia and rumor, Mercy Caldwell steps into a marriage forged by debt and hears vows that sound like mercy instead of vengeance. Yet the past is not finished with them. A ledger hides a betrayal, a pressed flower keeps a secret, and between duty and desire lies a choice that could remake everything. If you're ready for a love story where dignity defies scandal and tenderness rewrites fate, stay with me. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what you crave most in period romances, forbidden vows, slow burn glances, or triumph after disgrace. New Orleans, Louisiana, in the year 1869. The city still bore the restless scars of war. Streets lined with magnolias heavy with fragrance, carriages rattling over uneven cobblestones, and verandas hung with faded bunting from a vanished era. Beneath the music of distant steamboat whistles, families like the Caldwells struggled to maintain the illusion of old grandeur, while the world around them turned on iron wheels and new fortunes. Inside the once proud Caldwell house, the air smelled of pressed lavender and moth-eaten velvet. Tall mirrors with chipped gilt frames reflected a drawing room whose elegance had thinned to a ghost of itself. Mercy Caldwell stood near the window, fingers tightening around the edge of a worn lace curtain, while her mother adjusted the corset of a gown that had once drawn admiring stares at Mardi Gras balls. The silk was now dulled to a tired grey-green. The jewels at her throat had long since been pawned. "You will be looked after," her mother said, the words breaking against her teeth like glass. "Elias Marchant is respectable now. He has means." The woman's hands trembled as she tightened the ribbon of her collar. She did not meet Mercy's eyes. Mercy's heart beat against her ribs as if trying to escape. Elias Marchant. The name tasted of cold iron. Years ago, at one of her father's glittering soirees, she had watched him humiliate the young financier with a single cutting remark, a laughter that spread like wildfire across the room. Mercy had been a girl then, hidden behind her mother's skirts, but she remembered the look in Elias's eyes, steel blue, not angry but carved with quiet endurance. And now, that man would be her husband. A cryptic letter lay on the escritoire near the window. The handwriting was her younger sister's, hurried and uneven. No mention of the arrangement, only a line about things not being safe and keeping her promise. Mercy had read it 3 times, tracing the ink with her fingertip until the words blurred. She turned from the window and caught her reflection in the mirror. The girl staring back wore a pale muslin dress suited for travel, not celebration. Her hair, a light brown touched with gold, had been braided low and secured with an ivory comb, a modest adornment, a signal of surrender. Her hazel-green eyes, usually bright, were dimmed by resignation. There were no flowers at her throat, no lace veil, only the faint scent of orange blossoms her mother had pinned at the hem of her skirt, a desperate nod to tradition. The sound of boots echoed in the hallway. Her father appeared, face drawn tight, his once proud shoulders stooped under invisible debts. He did not speak at first. Instead, he brushed a speck of dust from his cuff, a gesture of a man still clinging to a phantom of dignity. "You will go now," he said finally. "The carriage waits." Mercy's lips parted, but no words came. She wished to ask if he felt any regret, any tenderness, but the silence between them had grown too dense. She dipped her head in a small nod and gathered the folded shawl from the chair. Her mother's eyes followed her, full of something like panic, but sealed behind propriety. Outside, the carriage stood waiting beneath the draping branches of a magnolia tree. Its blossoms had begun to brown at the edges, their sweetness overripe. The driver, a man she did not know, tipped his hat and opened the door. Mercy paused on the threshold, her fingers brushing the smooth wood of the doorframe one last time. Inside the carriage, the air was heavy with the smell of leather and faint cigar smoke. The city rolled past the window, gas lamps flickering in the dusk, iron balconies crowded with trailing vines, children playing barefoot in the street. She felt each turn of the wheels as a low pulse in her bones. They crossed Esplanade Avenue and turned toward the quieter district where the merchant residence stood. The house came into view slowly, a two-story structure of pale stucco and dark shutters set back from the street behind a wrought-iron gate. It was neither grand nor meagre. Its walls were clean, its garden trimmed, a place built for purpose rather than display. No guests waited on the veranda, no flowers draped the railing, only a single lamp burned at the entry, casting a circle of amber light onto the steps. Mercy stepped down from the carriage. The evening air was thick, warm, and smelled of river water. She drew the shawl tighter around her shoulders. The door opened before she could reach for the knocker. There he was, Elias Marchant, taller than she remembered, shoulders broad beneath a charcoal frock coat. His hair was darker now, streaked with grey at the temples, and his beard trimmed close, a style more modern than the men she had known as a girl. His steel blue eyes met hers without flinching. He did not smile. He did not scowl. He simply regarded her as if weighing not her face, but the shape of her resolve. "Mrs. Marchant," he said quietly, offering his hand. The voice was low, steady, carrying no hint of triumph. Mercy hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her gloved fingers in his. The warmth of his palm startled her. He guided her across the threshold, into a hallway lined with bookshelves and oil lamps instead of portraits. She felt the weight of her old life slip behind her like the closing of a heavy door. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and paper, not perfume or banquets. No music played, no laughter echoed. It was a place of silence, purposeful and waiting. And as Elias released her hand, Mercy felt a tremor run through her, not of fear but of something she could not yet name, a vibration beneath the surface of her skin, like a question she had never dared to ask. She stood there, cloaked not in bridal finery but in tension and shame, a stranger inside her own fate. And in that stillness, the lamplight flickered as if it knew what she did not, that the life she had been sold into was not the one she had been taught to imagine. The church was small, old, and forgotten by those who still measured devotion in chandeliers and carriages. It stood on the edge of the garden district, like a relic that had survived both war and weather, its stones worn soft, its windows muted by time. A single cypress tree leaned against its facade, as if shielding it from the weight of what it would witness that day. Inside, the scent of beeswax and old wood lingered in the air. The pews, though polished, bore the scars of decades, initials carved by restless boys, watermarks from storm seasons, hymnals with pages torn by age and grief. A few guests filled the seats, not family, not friends, but social scavengers and watchful enemies, drawn to scandal as moths to flame. Whispers passed through gloved hands and perfumed collars. "She is the Caldwell girl, isn't she? He's marrying her? After what her father did to him? I heard he bought her outright. A private agreement. No dowry." They didn't bother lowering their voices. Mercy stood just outside the sanctuary, heart thudding beneath the pale blue bodice of her gown. The fabric was new but modest, sewn hastily by a discreet seamstress. It bore no embroidery, no pearls. Only a tiny brooch at her collar, a cameo carved in ivory, once belonging to her grandmother. It was the last true heirloom her mother had pressed into her hand that morning, along with a tremulous, "Smile when you must," but she hadn't smiled. Not once. Through the open doors she saw the minister waiting. Reverend Burke stood tall in his black coat and white collar, his hands folded neatly over the worn leather of his Bible. His face, long and deeply lined, carried the air of a man who had seen too much and judged too little. He had known Elias Marchant in youth, before the scandal, before the silence. Beside him stood Elias. No flowers adorned the altar, no ribbons floated from the rafters. There was only the presence of the man himself, still and unreadable, like an oak rooted in the earth. His frock coat was of deep grey, the collar starched, the cravat dark as storm clouds. No boutonniere adorned his lapel. His hands, gloveless, were steady at his sides. Mercy stepped forward. Each footfall echoed louder than it should have. The satin of her skirts brushed her ankles with a sound like wind across a page. As she approached, she looked up at the man who would become her husband, not by affection, not by arrangement of hearts, but by necessity. Her gaze searched his face for some sign of cruelty, something sharp, something cold. Instead, she found exhaustion, and beneath it, something else, a strange kind of grace. He bowed his head in greeting, then extended his hand, not to claim, not to command, but to offer. Her fingers trembled as they met his. Reverend Burke opened the Bible. The ceremony began. The words were spoken with solemn cadence, falling like stones into a still pond. There were no declarations of joy, no laughter from pews, only the occasional clearing of a throat, the quiet rustle of silk gloves, and the shuffling of Simeon Black as he took his seat at the back. Black's presence was a shadow at the edge of the light. Dressed in a plum-colored coat, a smile curling at the corner of his mouth, he watched with the indulgence of a man who believed he'd already won. He did not blink. And then it came. The moment of vows. Reverend Burke turned to Elias. "Do you, Elias Marchant, take this woman?" "I do," Elias said, steady, measured. Then, with a subtle shift of breath, he looked at Mercy. "I take her not as payment, not as penance, but as companion, should she allow it. I offer not punishment, but protection, not silence, but the right to speak. I will not demand her trust, but I will live in such a way that she may offer it freely if she ever chooses." A murmur rippled through the room. Mercy's lungs stopped moving. The air had thickened, the pews had leaned forward, and even the cypress outside seemed to lean in. She had prepared herself for humiliation, for a cold ceremony, perhaps a public shaming, or at the very least indifference. But this vow of dignity, it was a gift she did not know how to hold. When the Reverend turned to her, her voice caught behind her ribs. She managed only a whisper, "I do," and hoped it was enough. Their hands were joined. The ring, simple gold, slid onto her finger with no ceremony. No one clapped, no one wept. There was no music, only the silence of astonishment. Outside the church, the light had begun to shift. The sun hovered low behind the rooftops, casting amber streaks across the cobblestone. The same carriage waited, but Elias did not gesture toward it. Instead, he offered her his arm. "Would you prefer to walk?" he asked. She blinked, startled. "It's only 3 blocks, if you're not too tired." Mercy hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I'd prefer it." They walked in silence. Her fingers rested lightly on his forearm, more for form than for comfort. The sounds of the city wrapped around them. Children calling, bells in the distance, the clatter of hooves on stone. They passed no one who dared speak to them. A few onlookers turned, recognizing them, recognizing her. The girl who had fallen from society's favor and now returned not on the arm of a debutante's match, but of the man her father once scorned. At the house, the door opened before they reached it. The same soft amber glow poured from within. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of cedar and tobacco leaf. A house of order, no chaos, no noise. Mercy stepped inside and turned, unsure of what came next. Elias did not touch her. He removed his gloves slowly, then nodded toward the stairs. "I had your trunk placed in the master bedroom," he said. "If it doesn't please you, you may choose another. There's a writing room off the library. I imagine you read." She nodded, too startled to speak. "I will sleep in the study," he continued. "At least until you wish otherwise. You are not obligated to perform anything tonight, or ever." The way he said it, not kindly, not coldly, but factually, undid something in her spine. "Why did you say those things?" she asked, her voice small. "At the altar." He looked at her for a long moment. "Because I meant them," he said simply, "and because vengeance doesn't interest me, but restoration might." Then he bowed his head slightly. as if to dismiss himself, and disappeared down the hall. Mercy remained alone in the entryway. The chandelier above her glimmered with gaslight, its crystals catching fragments of her reflection. Her hand went to the ring at her finger. It was warm, not from the metal, but from the memory of his touch. She climbed the stairs slowly. The master bedroom was spacious, with dark wood furniture and pale curtains that moved slightly in the breeze. A vase on the table held fresh gardenias. She wondered who placed them there. Sitting at the edge of the bed, she exhaled, not fear, not despair, but a kind of confusion that was not entirely painful. Downstairs, the study door clicked shut. And upstairs, Mercy Caldwell, now Marchant, sat still in her wedding gown, alone, watching the light flicker against the wallpaper. The vows had been spoken, the ring worn, but nothing had been taken, nothing demanded, only offered. And for the first time in her life, she did not know what to do with such a gift. The morning light filtered through pale muslin curtains, casting soft golden streaks across the bedroom walls. Mercy rose slowly from the wide bed, still wrapped in the unfamiliar stillness of the house. The sheets smelled faintly of lavender and sun-dried cotton, a comforting scent that contrasted with the tight knot in her chest. She touched the ring at her finger, a quiet weight, not yet warm with meaning, and drew the curtains open. Below, the garden stretched in disciplined symmetry. Neatly trimmed hedges flanked narrow gravel paths, and a solitary magnolia tree stood tall in one corner, its leaves rustling gently in the breeze. Beyond the garden wall, the distant sound of carriage wheels clattered over the cobblestones of the garden district, but within the walls of the Marchant house, silence ruled. She dressed herself in a modest morning gown of pale grey, the bodice high and the sleeves narrow, her movements careful and deliberate. There was no maid to assist her, no bell to summon service. Mercy's presence in the house, it seemed, was to be self-governed. She stepped into the hallway where the dark wood floors gleamed beneath her slippers. Paintings in subdued colours lined the walls, landscapes mostly, and one or two charcoal sketches of distant cities. There was no sign of personal vanity, no painted portrait of Elias, no heraldry. Only quiet things, chosen not to impress, but to endure. The air carried the subtle scent of polished oak and tobacco leaf. It reminded her of a library, or perhaps a gentleman's club, the kind her father used to frequent before the debts devoured everything. Mercy made her way downstairs, the weight of the house settling over her like a shawl made of memory and caution. The parlour to the right of the entry was surprisingly spare. A faint rug covered the centre of the floor, its pattern faded with time. The furniture was sturdy, upholstered in moss green and deep navy. A small fireplace, cold now, waited beneath a carved wooden mantel. On the table lay a single book, Meditations on the Psalms, its spine gently worn. She lifted it, half expecting dust, but found none. This was not a forgotten place. It was maintained, cared for, but untouched. The library revealed itself behind a set of tall double doors down the corridor. Her breath caught as she entered. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, filled with volumes in muted leather bindings, philosophy, history, poetry, the sciences. There were no idle romances, no volumes for show. These books had been read, marked, revisited. A heavy desk stood near the center, papers arranged with almost military precision. Quills, an inkwell, a letter opener with a dark wooden handle. On the far side of the room, tucked between two windows, sat a narrower desk, simpler in design. It was there that her eyes fell upon a small stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. She hesitated, hands suspended over them like a question. Then, slowly, she untied the knot. The handwriting was elegant and even, with the confidence of a woman who once wrote daily. I believe the room should have windows, even if the glass breaks in the storm. Light heals more than silence ever will. Another page. Mrs. Caraway says the women need sewing space, but I think what they need more is someone to listen to them without pity or condescension. Widows, yes, but not broken things. If only someone would build the walls. And then, folded between the letters, a page torn from a notebook. Drawn in pencil was a layout of a modest room with wide tables, shelves of books, and a little garden visible from the back windows. It was unsigned. But at the bottom there was a small pressed flower, delicate and yellowed with time. A marigold. Mercy's fingers hovered over the brittle petals. A cold tremor passed through her chest. "She was always planting marigolds," came a voice behind her. She turned sharply. Elias stood at the doorway, one hand resting against the wood panel, his expression unreadable. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said quickly, setting the letters down. "You're not intruding," he replied. They were hers. Clara. "My wife." Mercy said nothing. "She used to write in here," he added after a pause. "Mostly letters to herself, I think. Plans. She had ideas that no one listened to." Mercy glanced again at the drawing. It was a reading room. "Yes," Elias said softly. "She wanted to open one. For women who had lost everything and had nowhere to go. It was a dream she held on to, even when everything else fell apart." The silence between them thickened. Mercy wanted to ask what happened, what took Clara from the world, but the words tangled in her throat. "She died in the middle of it all," he said, as if hearing the question in her gaze. "When the business collapsed, when your father and the others ruined my name, when I stopped being welcome in any home that served brandy on silver trays." His jaw tightened. "She became invisible before she stopped breathing." Mercy's lips parted, but no comfort came. She could not tell him she was sorry. Her name, her very presence in this house, was part of that wound. Elias crossed the room and picked up the flower. "She pressed this one the day we bought the lot for the reading room. It never got built. Everything was repossessed. Everything but this house, and even that was almost taken." He let the marigold fall back into place and looked at her. "I'm not a man who forgets, but I am a man who chooses what to carry." Then, with a quiet nod, he stepped back, leaving her alone once more. That evening Mercy dined alone. The table was long, designed for 10, though only one place had been set. A housekeeper appeared briefly, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that said she'd seen too much. She did not ask questions. She served roasted duck and buttered greens and vanished like smoke. Elias did not join her. The solitude scraped against her bones. Mercy had known silence in her life. Her mother's bitter silences, her father's silences filled with cold thunder. But this was different. The quiet of the Marchant house was deliberate, not empty, but purposeful. After dinner, she walked the hallway again. She paused before a closed door. Behind it, the study. She could hear the scratch of a pen on paper, the shifting of weight in a chair, but she did not knock. She did not dare. Instead, she returned to the library and retrieved Clara's letters once more. This time, she read slowly. She imagined the woman who had written these lines. Strong, articulate, unafraid of being seen. And then she wondered what had silenced her. Not death, not illness, but the slow erosion of a woman who was not heard. Mercy's hand closed around the marigold. She did not press it further. She simply held it. And in the stillness of the house, so bare, so disciplined, so careful, she began to understand something deeper than resentment or grief. This was a house of ashes, of things burned down and rebuilt, not in fire, but in silence. And she had been planted here like a seed someone hoped would never bloom. But the roots were already pressing into the floorboards, and the flower she carried in her palm had not crumbled. Not yet. The month of May arrived with a deceptive softness, as if the city itself wished to lull its citizens into forgetting how easily the heat would soon strangle the air. New Orleans pulsed with activity, its streets alive with the rattle of carts and the hum of gossip. Beneath the perfumed lace of parasols and behind the shuttered eyes of grand homes, rumors unfurled like ivy, twisting, climbing, choking. In the heart of it all, Elias Marchant moved with quiet precision. Each morning he left the house before the sun reached its full weight, his boots echoing on the stone steps, his coat clean, his collar perfectly folded. He spoke little during breakfast, when he shared it, and returned late, the scent of rail dust and ink still clinging to his skin. There was something almost sacred in the way he carried his solitude, like a man who had learned to wear silence as others wore silk. Mercy watched him from the window one morning, her fingertips resting on the cool glass. There was no romance in his departure, no farewell kiss, no lingering look, and yet she could not look away. He belonged to the world in a way she did not yet understand, and that mystery pulled at her like a current. The days began to shift. The stillness of the Marchant house gave way to subtle disruptions. Letters arrived more frequently. Men in dark coats waited longer on the stoop before being turned away by a stern housekeeper, and one afternoon, when Mercy came down the stairs holding a volume of poetry to return to the library, she heard voices, low, clipped, familiar. She paused in the corridor. "Your terms are unacceptable," Elias said. "You know that." The voice that responded was smooth as oiled velvet. "I offer opportunity, Elias, not chains. But if you're afraid of ambition, I can take my gold elsewhere." "Simeon, your gold is soaked in manipulation. I won't owe you, not again." Mercy's spine tensed. The name alone sent cold fingers tracing her skin. Elias's footsteps moved toward the door, his voice lowering. "This conversation is over." "You'll regret it," Simeon replied, too softly for her to hear more. Mercy stepped back just in time for the library door to open. Elias emerged first, jaw set, hands stiff at his sides. Simeon Black followed a moment later, his plum-colored coat unwrinkled, his ivory cravat tied with impeccable care. He looked as if the meeting had not touched him at all. When he saw Mercy standing at the stairs base, his mouth curved in a slow, elegant smile, he removed his gloves one finger at a time. "Mrs. Marchant," he said smoothly, bowing just enough to remain within the bounds of propriety. "What a pleasure it is to see you again." Elias paused mid-stride but said nothing. Mercy gave the faintest nod, her lips still. There was no warmth in her eyes. "I hope your new home suits you," Simeon added. "I imagine it must feel strange, returning to a name your family once stepped over." His gaze flicked toward Elias. "Or tried to." "That's enough," Elias said. "You're not welcome here." But Simeon's smile only deepened. "I was never truly welcome, Elias. Not in parlors, not at salons, but in drawing rooms where fortunes are traded. I'm always welcome there." He turned toward Mercy one last time. "Do enjoy the library. Clara had good taste." And with that he departed, gloves in hand, his boots silent on the polished floor. That evening Elias did not return for dinner. Mercy ate alone once more, pushing peas across her plate without appetite. The house had lost its peaceful silence. In its place was something tight, almost brittle, like a glass waiting to be cracked. 2 days later Simeon returned, but not to the house. Mercy was walking through Lafayette Square, escorted by Mrs. Vernet, a widow who organized charity events for war widows and orphans. They had just finished discussing a relief fund for a burned-down orphanage when Simeon appeared near the fountain. He wore a light suit and a wide smile. His presence felt theatrical, an actor stepping into his scene. He tipped his hat and greeted Mrs. Vernet with too much charm. "My, the city is brighter with such company. Might I steal a moment from you, Mrs. Marchant?" Before Mercy could decline, Mrs. Vernet excused herself to greet another woman across the square. Simeon leaned in, voice velvet. "Does he confide in you, I wonder? Tell you how close his rail project is to ruin? Or does he keep you in the dark, as he once did his investors?" Mercy stood still, chin high. "You should go." He ignored her. "You know, your father used to speak with such conviction, about markets, about debts, about how ruin was just a storm you could wait out. He didn't wait long enough." She stiffened. "I've invited your parents to town," he continued, adjusting his cufflinks. They were quite eager. Thought you might be the key to opening a door or two for them. Her breath caught. They'll be here tomorrow, he added with a smile, and very hopeful that their daughter still remembers how to listen. Then, as if nothing had passed between them, he bowed and turned, disappearing into the crowd. The next day, it rained. Mercy stood beneath the portico of the Marchant home, watching the street glisten beneath the storm. A black carriage pulled up, its windows misted. When the door opened, her mother stepped out, cloak damp, hair pinned too tightly, eyes wide with false hope. Her father followed, shoulders hunched, lips pursed. Both looked thinner, older but no less proud. "Mercy," her mother said, grasping her arm before the umbrella could be offered. "We were so afraid you'd forget us." Inside, they spoke in low voices, her mother clutching her hand, her father standing stiff in the corner. "Simeon has offered to assist your husband," her father said. "A necessary loan. You should persuade him to accept. The family's name depends on it." "The family's name," Mercy whispered, "or your comfort." Her mother shushed her, eyes darting. "Please, darling, this could save us." Mercy stood slowly, pulling her hand free. "He does not need your poison, neither do I." She walked to the door, opened it, and said nothing more. That night the house was quiet again, but not with peace. She found Elias in the library, seated at the large desk, a ledger open before him. He wore no coat, sleeves rolled, his cravat loosened. The gaslight cast amber shadows across his face. He did not hear her at first. Mercy stepped closer. "Why won't you let him help you?" Elias looked up slowly. His eyes met hers, not angry, not surprised, just tired. "Because I've paid enough for what he calls help." She sat across from him, hands folded. "I know what they're saying," he continued, voice low, "that I married you for revenge, that I intend to display you like a trophy, that I bought you." Mercy flinched but did not look away. "They're wrong," he added. "Then why won't you say anything?" she asked. "To them, to me." He closed the ledger softly. "Because saying the truth aloud doesn't make it heard." They sat in silence. In the flicker of gaslight, across the distance of a heavy oak desk, they regarded one another. No vows were exchanged, no promises made, only the fragile offering of a moment shared without armor. Outside, the rain eased, and the house exhaled, waiting for whatever would come next. The late summer sun stretched languidly across the city, tinting New Orleans in amber and rose. From the Marchant house, the sound of carriage wheels and street hawkers arrived only as a faint echo, softened by the high garden walls. Mercy sat at the library table, her gloved fingers splayed across a scatter of Clara's letters. She had read them so often now that she could feel their texture even with her eyes closed. The delicate paper, the faint impression of ink pressed by a steady hand, the faint ghost of lavender perfume that still clung to them like a memory refusing to fade. That morning had begun like many others. The distant sound of Elias leaving before dawn, the house awakening with quiet footsteps of servants she rarely saw, and the stillness of a parlor that seemed to hold its breath. But something in her had shifted. Clara's words had seeped under her skin like a quiet current, impossible to ignore. She unfolded another page. "I believe a room can heal," Clara had written. "Not a grand hall, but a simple one. A room where widows may sit without shame, where children may touch books without fear. A room where no one pretends to be anything but what they are." Mercy's throat tightened. She imagined Clara seated at this very desk, the lamplight catching her hair, shaping her dreams into words. The sketch lay at the bottom of the bundle, penciled with deliberate care. A modest hall, tall windows facing a small garden, tables arranged for reading and writing, shelves brimming with books, and in one corner, a hearth. At the edge of the page, in the same steady hand, Clara had added a single note: "Light heals more than silence ever will." Mercy stared at that line until it blurred. That afternoon, she began writing invitations. Her script was careful but firm, each name chosen with intent. teachers she had met through Mrs. Vernet, two seamstresses from the quarter who had once stitched gowns for her mother's friends, a widow who ran a small boarding house for orphans. No engraved cards, no gilded edges, just plain envelopes, sealed with a modest stamp. She would host them quietly, without society's noise. Not salons for gossip, but for purpose. That evening the parlour came alive in a way the house had not yet known. Candles flickered in brass holders. A small table bore a pot of tea and biscuits she had ordered from a bakery on Magazine Street. Women entered timidly at first, clutching their shawls, their voices lowered, but the scent of tea and the softness of lamplight soon coaxed them into conversation. Mercy moved among them with a calm she did not know she possessed, her hair swept into a low knot, her dress of deep green wool with only a cameo at the throat. The talk was quiet but steady. Wages too small, children unable to read, husbands gone to war and never returned. Mercy listened more than she spoke. Her eyes travelled from face to face, seeing not pity, but resilience. She thought of Clara's dream and felt, for the first time since her wedding, the faint pulse of a purpose larger than survival. When the last guest had left, she remained in the parlour long after the candles burned low, fingers resting on the back of a chair. The scent of tea had seeped into the upholstery. For a fleeting moment, she imagined Clara stepping through the door, smiling at the scene, her plan no longer trapped in paper. Days later, while searching the library for a volume of local history to share at the next gathering, Mercy pulled a heavy atlas from the lowest shelf. It resisted slightly, as though something behind it pressed back. Curious, she tugged harder. The atlas slid out, revealing a narrow cavity lined with dust. Inside lay a leather-bound ledger, its edges worn, but its clasp still strong. She hesitated. Then, with careful fingers, she opened it. Rows of figures stared up at her, neat columns of debts and credits, names she did not know and names she did. Near the middle pages she saw it. Caldwell and Associates, her father's firm, scrawled beside numbers that made no sense. Withdrawals hidden in false accounts. Payments marked confidential, tied to rail contracts. And beside them, faint notations of Elias's early company, losses timed to those very transactions. Her breath caught. She turned another page. More entries. Her father's handwriting, unmistakable, looping and elegant. The ledger told a story she had never heard, but somehow always feared, that her father had not simply failed Elias, but helped orchestrate his ruin. A tremor passed through her. She pressed her palm to her forehead as if she could stop the words from sinking in. The room seemed to tilt. She closed the ledger, clutching it to her chest as though it could still be hidden. The garden called her like a refuge. She fled there, skirts brushing the hall's polished floor, slipping through the French doors into the humid afternoon. The magnolia tree's shadow fell across her face. The scent of its blossoms was too sweet, too heavy. She stumbled to a stone bench and sat, the ledger still in her lap. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. Tears streaked her cheeks, warm against the breeze. She bent forward, her fingers digging into the leather cover. Clara's marigold pressed between the letters flashed in her mind. Mercy had wanted to be part of Clara's dream, but she was part of her tragedy instead. She did not hear Elias approach. When she finally sensed him, she did not look up. She felt his shadow first, then the faint shift of the bench as he sat beside her, not too close, not distant either. "I see you found it," he said quietly. Her voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I had nothing to tell you that you didn't already know in some way," he replied. "I could have shown you the proof years ago. It would have changed nothing." She lifted her head, eyes red. "You knew all of it, and still you—" Her voice broke. "Still you married me." He met her gaze, his steel blue eyes steady, unreadable, yet gentle. "I married you because I could see you were not them." Her fingers tightened on the ledger. "But you must hate me for what they did." "No," he said softly. "I have enough hate to carry for myself. Not for you." His words settled over her like a strange kind of mercy, heavier than anger, softer than absolution. She searched his face, waiting for the flicker of vengeance she had expected since the day they met. But there was none, only weariness, and something quieter. Resolve, perhaps, or the faint echo of hope. The silence stretched, not hostile but trembling. The magnolia leaves rustled above them. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage rattled past. "You can leave the ledger where it was," Elias said at last, "or you can keep it. It makes no difference to me now." Mercy swallowed, wiping her cheeks with the back of her glove. "I don't know what to do with it." "Then don't do anything," he murmured. "Not yet." He stood, brushing dust from his trousers, but did not walk away immediately. For a moment, his hand hovered near her shoulder, as though he might rest it there. Then, with a subtle shift of breath, he withdrew it. "You have guests tonight," he said quietly. "You should not let them see you like this." And then he left her beneath the magnolia tree, the ledger heavy in her lap, the scent of blossoms pressing down like a confession. Mercy stared at the garden path long after he was gone. The marigold from Clara's sketch drifted through her mind again, its fragile petals, its stubborn color. She closed her eyes and felt the weight of two truths: that she had been planted in the ashes of another woman's dream, and that somehow she still wanted it to grow. She sat until the sky dimmed, and the lamps of the house glowed like faint stars, her tears drying into salt. When at last she rose, the ledger under her arm, she was no lighter. But she was different, less a guest, more a keeper of something too heavy to name. The summer deepened. In New Orleans, heat did not simply arrive, it clung. It seeped into walls, into the stitching of gloves, into the roots of breath itself. And yet, through the heavy air and under the weight of expectation, something had begun to shift in the Marchant household. Mercy had changed. She no longer lingered in shadowed corners or paused before speaking. She moved through the city with quiet composure, her spine straight, her gaze steady, a woman no longer defined by whispers. Her presence at Elias's side at public appearances was neither timid nor boastful. She did not smile for effect. She did not speak unless her words held weight. And still, people watched her. They watched her walk beside Elias through the levee district, where rail tracks curved like ribs toward the river. They watched her speak gently with dock workers, sleeves rolled to their elbows, their faces lined by labor and sun. She asked about their children. She spoke of literacy, of shelter, of Clara's reading room, now no longer a memory, but a possibility. On Thursday evenings, her salons became something more than modest gatherings. They became a hum, a movement. Tea and biscuits remained, but now there were ink-stained fingers among the porcelain. Teachers, journalists, two women who ran print shops on opposite ends of the city, a widow who had once taught in secret during the war. They listened to Mercy, not because she raised her voice, but because she did not. She spoke as Clara had once written, plainly, but with hope. And hope in New Orleans was both balm and provocation. It did not take long for Simeon Black to notice. First came the delays. A shipment of steel rails from Pennsylvania, marked for Elias's new southern spur, vanished in transit. Then came the rumors, whispered between merchants and murmured in the smoking rooms of banks. Marchant's line was unstable. Investors were pulling out. His wife, it was said, was the true face behind the scheme, sent to polish a tarnished name. Elias did not confront the gossip. He never had. He simply worked longer hours, penned more letters, reviewed contracts deep into the night, sometimes forgetting to eat, always returning home with dust on his boots and tension in his jaw. One afternoon, as Mercy crossed Jackson Square with a basket of pamphlets from her latest salon, a man in a city inspector's coat stopped her carriage. "Marchant's yard has been flagged," he said coolly. "Violations, structural deficiencies, dangerous for workers." She met his eyes. "When was this decided?" "Today." "And when was the inspection?" The man tipped his hat without answering and walked away. That evening, Elias confirmed what she had already sensed. "They'll close the yard if we don't correct it by Monday," he said, his voice even but hollow around the edges. "There's nothing structurally wrong. The inspection was convenient." "Simeon?" she asked. He nodded. "And you won't fight it publicly?" "No," he said, "because if I give him my fury, I give him power." Mercy said nothing, but something deep in her lungs felt like it was burning. 2 nights later, a letter arrived, hand-delivered. It bore no seal, only her name, penned in sweeping script across cream-colored stationery. She opened it slowly in the library, the same place where she had once held Clara's marigold. "Dearest Mercy," it began, "we rarely get to choose the war we inherit, but we may choose how long we bleed from it. Meet me at the Orléans Club, noon. Discretion, as always." It was unsigned, but she knew who had written it. She arrived late on purpose, dressed in a pale blue gown with no frills, her hat simple, her gloves practical. The club's parlour smelled of brandy and secrets. Simeon sat near the window, framed by a curtain of red velvet and filtered sunlight. He stood as she approached, too polished, too rehearsed. "You've grown sharp," he said. "It suits you." "I'm not here for your flattery," Mercy replied, sitting across from him. "Then allow me to trade it for truth." He slid a document across the table, aged, creased, stamped. "I imagine Elias never told you the full story. How he lost not only his business, but his freedom." "Briefly, yes, but enough. Your father forged documents that implicated Elias in fraudulent accounts. The arrest was swift, the exoneration less so." Mercy's fingers hovered over the paper, but she did not touch it. Simeon leaned in. "That ledger you found was only a part. There were letters, signatures, agreements made in shadowed rooms. Why tell me now? Because your name still matters. You could still be useful. And because I don't enjoy watching you play wife to a man who lets you carry his ruin." Her lips parted, but no words emerged. He continued, voice velvet. "You've become impressive, but that won't save him. I can. My offer remains. Secure the deal, convince him, or watch it all fall again." That night, her parents arrived at dinner uninvited. They were escorted into the marchant parlour like ghosts come to reclaim the living. Her mother wore her old mourning brooch. Her father's cane tapped against the hardwood like a ticking clock. Over duck in citrus glaze, her mother made her plea. "Mercy, darling, sometimes we must bend a little to survive." Mercy did not look at her. "Just speak to him," her mother continued. "Sacrifice a little dignity so that we all might live." The words slipped into the air like poison in perfume. Mercy placed her fork down slowly. Her voice, when it came, was cool and deliberate. "No," her mother blinked. "Mercy," she stood. "If you want to survive, do it without my spine." She left them at the table, the dishes untouched, the wine half full. Upstairs, she paused before Elias's study, then past it. Her feet carried her not to her room, but to his. The door was ajar. He sat at the edge of the bed, coat removed, vest unbuttoned, hands clasped between his knees. The lamp cast long shadows behind him. He did not look up. She stepped inside. "I know what my father did," she said. He nodded once, barely. "I know about the arrest, the signatures, all of it." His voice, when it came, was low. "I never wanted you to carry that. But I already do," she whispered. He raised his eyes. For the first time, there was no armor there, only the raw, quiet ache of a man who had spent too many years unspoken for. She stepped closer. The silence between them shimmered. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted, "any of it, but I don't want to be your burden, or your penance, or your proof that you survived." "You're not," he said, standing slowly. "You're the only thing I didn't lose." Her breath caught. She hadn't expected tenderness, not then. Their hands did not meet, but their eyes held. The air between them pulsed, not with desire, but with something older, heavier, something like devotion born from ruin. When she turned to leave, he stopped her, not with touch, but with a question. "Will you stay?" She turned back, and in the quiet she nodded. And for the first time in that house, 2 rooms became one. Not in passion, not in ceremony, but in the quiet joining of 2 people who had carried too much for too long. Dawn broke over New Orleans in shades of pewter and pale gold, the kind of morning that carried no promise of peace. The air was damp and heavy with jasmine and tension, and inside the Marchant home, silence lay stretched like a sheet pulled too tight. Mercy sat at the small writing desk in her room, her pen poised above a blank page, unmoving. The letter she had tried to compose to her sister would not come. Words failed her when feelings surged too close to the skin. Her father's voice still echoed from the night before, full of clipped demands dressed as pleas, and her mother's tears had left a stain not only on the lace cuff of Mercy's sleeve, but on the last flicker of hope she held for understanding. She rose and crossed the hall. Her parents were housed in the guest quarters, the ones rarely used since Clara's passing. Mercy knocked once, not out of politeness, but to announce that this would not be a quiet conversation. Her mother answered, eyes already puffy with weeping, her silver hair coiled too tightly, her corset too desperate. Her father sat in the corner, spine stiff, lips pressed into a line as though any softness might betray him. "Mercy," her mother began, already rising. "We were just—" "No," Mercy said. Her mother faltered. "Darling, please, we were only trying—" "I am no longer yours to direct. I'm not the price you trade for comfort, nor the child you press into rooms to fetch redemption." Her father's mouth curled. "You are ungrateful." "And you are shameless," she replied. He stood then, slow and calculated. "You live in the house of the man you ruined. You speak with the pride of a Marchant, but you wear the name Caldwell." "I wear it like a scar," she said softly, "and I've earned the right to decide who touches it." Her mother let out a choked sound, but Mercy turned her back. Her hand paused on the doorknob only a second before she pulled it open and stepped into the corridor. She did not look back. Later that morning, as the city churned with markets and street cries, Elias received word of a legal summons. A forged lien had been filed against his property. Simeon Black had unearthed a decades-old deed dispute. One Mercy suspected had been created from whole cloth. The signature was familiar. Too familiar. Elias's jaw set as he read the document. Mercy stood beside him, arms folded, eyes tracking the length of the page. "They're claiming the original transfer of land to your name was invalid," he said. "That the plot Clara and I bought for the reading room still belongs to the St. Armand estate." "But Clara purchased it outright," Mercy said. "You showed me the receipts." "And the trust," Elias added, "which is missing from their case." Convenient. He would have gone silent then, as he often did when anger curled around his ribs like a vice. But a soft knock broke the moment. Reverend Burke stood in the threshold, his black frock coat still damp from the humidity, his old eyes sharper than they appeared. "I came to offer prayer," he said, "but if I may, I'll offer memory instead." He took a seat across from Elias and folded his hands. "Clara came to see me before her death. She asked for sanctuary. Not in the spiritual sense, but social. She wanted to speak, to testify. She had papers that could have protected you, witness accounts, business ledgers, names. But someone intercepted her. She never made it to court. And after the scandal, no one opened their door to her." Elias's eyes flickered, just once. "You never told me." "She asked me not to," Burke said. "She feared it would only deepen your shame." Mercy listened in silence, her heart thrumming in her ears. Clara's exile had not been a byproduct of misfortune. It had been orchestrated, staged. Simeon had silenced her, and now he sought to erase what little she left behind. Mercy rose without a word and climbed the stairs to the library. The air in the room was thick with old paper and determination. She pulled Clara's letters from the carved box, hands trembling only once. She laid them out, page after page of sketches, lists, plans, and found it. A letter written in the margin of an estate receipt. The Reading Room Trust, signed and notarized, protects the property from reassignment or seizure should I fall before it is built. Elias is named sole beneficiary, Clara Marchant. The ink was faded, but the notary seal bled into the page like truth resisting erasure. She stared at the parchment until her vision blurred, not with tears, but clarity. She knew what had to be done. The courtroom was plain, with no fanfare or grandeur, just polished benches and tall windows that let in too much heat. The city's elite did not attend, but those who came knew exactly why they were there. Elias sat at the defense table, shoulders squared, his face carved in stoic resolve. Mercy sat beside him, gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. Her gown was of deep plum, somber but dignified, and her hair was drawn back in a simple twist. The judge, a tall man with weary eyes, called the room to order. Simeon Black stood for the prosecution, flanked by two younger men in finer suits who said nothing and offered only smiles when addressed. They laid out their claim in practiced cadence. Land disputes, deed inconsistencies, inheritance confusion. The case, they said, was purely legal, not personal. Mercy's eyes never left Simeon's face. His voice slid across the room like oil on glass, smooth, unbothered, almost amused. When it was their turn, Elias rose. He spoke with restraint, as always, referencing the original deed, the payment records, the timeline. But the judge frowned, unconvinced. Paper alone, it seemed, would not unravel Black's scheme. And then Mercy stood. A hush fell across the room. She held the letter in both hands, carefully preserved in a clear case. She looked not at the judge, nor at Black, but at the rows of silent observers, teachers, seamstresses, widows, who had come without invitation, dressed plainly, eyes bright with something more dangerous than hope, memory. "I am not here as Elias Marchant's wife," she began. "I am here as the voice of the woman who should have stood in this place years ago." She stepped forward, her voice steady, carrying. Clara Marchant dreamed of a space where women could breathe without shame. She purchased that land, and she did not do so blindly. She protected it. This letter contains her notarized intent, a legal trust in my husband's name. She placed the document before the judge. This is not about property. This is about silencing a woman whose only crime was believing that service to others was more powerful than status. Simeon's smile cracked, just slightly. The judge studied the letter for several long moments, the seal gleaming under the gaslight. When he spoke, his voice was low. "This document renders the lien invalid. The claim is dismissed." Gasps broke in the gallery. Black's men stiffened. Mercy did not turn to look at him. She did not need to. Outside the courthouse, the sky had shifted. The city lay stretched in golden haze, and a breeze moved through the magnolias, lifting petals like fragile pieces of an old dream, finally let free. Elias stepped beside Mercy, his hand brushing the crook of her arm. He did not speak. She did not need him to. That night, the Marchant home stood still and silent. But the silence was no longer brittle, it was full, humming with the echo of justice long delayed and finally heard. In her room, Mercy lit a single candle and placed Clara's letter beside the marigold. She did not cry. She did not need to. She had spoken, and in doing so, she had reclaimed not only a name, but the right to bear it in truth. The courtroom swelled with bodies, pressed elbow to elbow, the kind of crowd that only gathered for blood or glory. Outside, the air hung low and grey, thick with the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Inside, the wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of speculation. Whispers moved through the gallery like smoke. New Orleans had come to watch Elias Marchant fall. And yet it was not Elias who stood when the clerk called the name, but Mercy. She rose with quiet certainty, her plum-coloured gown falling in elegant folds around her. Her gloves were pale, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. The hush that followed her motion was not of courtesy. It was of disbelief. A wife was meant to sit behind her husband, silent and still, a delicate ornament to power. But Mercy moved past Elias, past the long table, and came to stand in the open space before the judge's bench, with the grace of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to claim. The judge, a man of silver temples and weary posture, narrowed his eyes. "You wish to address the court, Mrs. Marchant?" "I do, Your Honor," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. Its strength was in its steadiness, its refusal to tremble. Simeon Black, seated with his attorneys 2 rows to her left, crossed one leg slowly over the other, his smile lazy, amused. His fingers drummed once on his lapel, as if keeping time to a tune only he could hear. Mercy opened the small case she held, withdrawing a single page. "This is a trust deed," she said, "executed and notarized by Clara Marchant before her death. It names Elias Marchant as the sole beneficiary of the land currently under dispute. It was created to protect the property from seizure should anything prevent its development. This trust is legally binding, Your Honor. It was never revoked." The judge leaned forward, his brows lifting slightly. Mercy stepped closer. Clara knew her voice might be silenced. She prepared for that. "This document," she raised it slightly, "is her voice, preserved, and I bring it forward, because she no longer can." A hush fell again, but this time it was not of disbelief. It was reverence. The judge extended his hand. She approached with measured steps and laid the trust upon the bench. He adjusted his spectacles and began to read. Simeon's smile tightened. Elias, still seated, watched his wife. His face gave nothing away, but something in his shoulders shifted, less burden, more breath. The judge looked up at last. "Mr. Black, were you aware of this trust?" Simeon rose slowly, as if each movement was rehearsed. "We had reason to believe the trust had been voided, Your Honor." "You had reason," the judge repeated, "but no proof." "No, Your Honor." The judge turned to Mercy. "This trust, Mrs. Marchant, do you know where it was found?" "In Clara's private documents," Mercy said. "In her own handwriting, with the seal intact. It was never contested, never rescinded, and was never brought before a court until today." The judge looked to Elias, then back at Black. "This lien is invalid," he said. "The claim is dismissed with prejudice." A murmur rose like thunder. The gallery erupted in a flurry of gasps, shifting feet, a few scattered claps quickly hushed by decorum. Mercy returned to her seat beside Elias, her breath shallow but even. Black did not rise again. His fingers curled against the chair. His eyes burned, not with outrage, but with something far older, injured pride. Elias turned his head slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet across the room. Simeon's expression gave one final flicker of calculation, of something still moving beneath the surface, and then he looked away. Outside the courthouse, the sky finally broke. Rain fell in warm, sudden sheets, washing the city in silver. Elias opened his umbrella and held it over Mercy's head as they walked the stone steps. She did not speak. Neither did he. But when his hand found the small of her back, when his touch steadied her against the wind, something passed between them. Unspoken, certain. Justice, long delayed, had arrived. But vengeance, wounded and cornered, was never far behind. That afternoon the rail yard exploded in chaos. The first fist flew during a routine delivery. A worker, bruised and sweating, accused another of theft. Voices rose. Accusations twisted into threats. Somewhere down the line, iron rods clanged to the ground. 2 men rolled into the mud, grappling, kicking. Others joined, not from fury but from fear, the kind that spreads faster than fire. Sabotage had arrived, not in the form of paperwork, but in whispers planted weeks ago. Simeon Black had poisoned the rail from beneath, stirring unrest where trust had once been forged. Elias was called from the office. By the time he arrived, 5 men were bloodied, a cart overturned, and half the yard had turned into a battlefield of suspicion. He stepped into the storm without hesitation. "Enough," he said, voice raised for the first time in months. No one heard him, or perhaps no one listened. And then Mercy arrived. She was not expected. No carriage had been sent for her. No footman escorted her. She came on foot, skirts soaked, hair half fallen from its pins, flanked by a dozen women. Teachers, widows, young mothers, women who had filled her salons, women who had brought stories to her parlor, women whose hands bore the marks of labor and resilience. They followed her through the gate, eyes alert, skirts muddied. She stepped into the yard. A metal rod clattered inches from her feet. She did not flinch. "Stop," she said. Some turned, others shouted over her. "I said stop," she repeated louder now, and this time they did, because there was something in her voice not of authority but of truth, the kind of truth that does not beg to be heard. It demands it. "This is not your fight," she said, her eyes sweeping the circle of men, "but you've been forced to bleed for it long enough." A few men straightened. "This yard feeds your families. These rails carry more than cargo. They carry your labor, your dignity. You are being used as weapons, as noise, to cover another man's retreat." She turned slowly, her words sharp as nails driven clean through silence. "I've seen the paper trail. I know who planted the lies. You've been given a mask of anger to wear, when what you should be holding is power." The men exchanged glances. The rods lowered. Mercy walked to the center. Her boots sank in the mud. Her dress clung to her ankles. She held her chin high. "If you tear this yard apart," she said, "he wins." "If you walk away, he wins. But if you stand still, if you think before you strike, then you win." Silence reigned. Then someone stepped back. Another dropped his fists. Within minutes, the fight dissolved. What remained was not peace, but clarity. Elias moved toward Mercy, his expression unreadable. Rain soaked his shoulders. He reached for her, but not to pull her away, only to touch her elbow. The gesture said everything. They stood in the center of the rail yard, surrounded by men and women whose gazes had shifted from war to witness, not of violence, but of something far rarer, transformation. That evening, the yard was quiet. Mercy stood by the upstairs window, her hair still damp, her gloves drying by the fire. Elias poured a glass of brandy and handed it to her without a word. She accepted it, sipped once, set it down. "You didn't ask me to come," she said. "No," he replied, "but you did." She turned to him, eyes catching the firelight. "And would you have stopped me if I hadn't?" He took a moment, then shook his head. "No, because I've seen what happens when a woman is silenced. I won't be part of that again." Outside, the city turned gold in the dusk. And within the house, the silence that settled was no longer the absence of words. It was the presence of understanding. They did not speak of what came next. They simply stood in the quiet they had earned side by side, two people no longer defined by what had been taken, but by what they had chosen to give. The morning the rail line opened was soft and gold-lit, with a sky the color of pale muslin stretched above the rooftops of New Orleans. There was no brass band, no parade of dignitaries, no streamers fluttering from windows. Instead, there were calloused hands holding coffee tins, women balancing baskets of fresh bread, and children with dirt on their cheeks and wonder in their eyes. The platform was not crowded, but it was full of the people who had helped build what had once seemed impossible. The workers stood beside their families, their coats pressed, their collars starched for the occasion. Wives in cotton shawls and simple gloves leaned close to hear the words of Reverend Burke, who stood at the head of the track, his Bible worn and hands steady. Mercy stood beside Elias, her gloved hand resting in his without ceremony, without shame. When the Reverend lifted his voice in blessing, it was not the polished speech of a politician, but the quiet benediction of a man who had buried too many dreams and was now asked to bless the birth of something brave. "Let what begins today be built not just with steel and stone, but with truth and mercy," he said. eyes sweeping over the workers, their children, the women who had prayed for bread and ended up laying track. May this rail carry more than goods. It must carry dignity, it must carry memory, and it must carry hope. The first train to cross the new track did not announce itself with a blaring whistle, but with the clean click of steel on steel, a hymn of effort, not celebration. It rolled forward slowly, the engine polished but not ornate. A single magnolia blossom, tied to its front railing with twine, swayed gently as it passed. Elias did not speak until the train was halfway down the track. "I never thought I'd see this again," he murmured. Mercy's fingers curled slightly in his. "You didn't just see it. You rebuilt it." He turned to look at her then, not as a man admiring a wife he had come to respect, but as one watching the sun rise on a world that no longer hurt to live in. "Not alone," he said. And in that quiet phrase was the acknowledgement of everything they had survived. Her father's betrayal, Simeon's machinations, and the weight of memory that had once sealed the windows of this city with silence. Across town, while the track hummed with new life, the front page of the New Orleans Daily Register bore a headline in bold serif letters: "Voices Unshackled, the Truth About Simeon Black." Beneath it, a teacher from Mercy's salons, Miss Lydia Fournier, had penned an editorial of breathtaking clarity. It was not emotional in tone, but piercing in detail. It recounted the forged debts, the blackmail of widows, the bribery of inspectors, and the silencing of witnesses. It named names. It cited public records, and it gave voice in simple sentences to men and women whose stories had been buried for years beneath ledger books and threats. By noon, whispers became a roar. By nightfall, Simeon Black had been summoned to appear in court in Baton Rouge, the same court that had once sentenced Elias for crimes he did not commit. Mercy read the article only once. She folded it carefully, tucked it into a linen-bound journal, and placed it beside Clara's letters in the study. Some victories did not need to be revisited. They simply needed to be honored. That evening, the Caldwell name was heard again, but only in hushed tones. A neighbor reported that the elder Mr. Caldwell had sold his last pair of cufflinks to pay a quiet debt. Mrs. Caldwell, once proud in lace and parasols, was seen leaving the city with her trunk strapped to a mule cart, her hat pulled low to shield her face. Mercy did not watch them go. She simply closed the window and let the curtain fall. A week later, a letter arrived, postmarked from Nashville, written in delicate cursive. It was from her sister, Lillian. "Dearest Mercy, the money came. I cried. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. I'm safe now, and the landlady here says I can stay if I help with chores. I've enrolled in the small seminary around the corner. I want to teach children who think no one sees them. I think I understand now what you gave up to keep me afloat. I will not waste it. I promise." "With all my love," Lillian Mercy pressed the letter to her chest, her eyes closing with a mix of relief and sorrow. In that moment, Elias stepped into the room, as if drawn not by footsteps, but by intuition. "She sounds strong," he said quietly. "She is," Mercy replied. "She just needed to be told she could be." Elias did not answer right away. He stepped closer, and in the warm hush between them, he unfolded a parchment. It was the latest amendment to the charter of the rail company. At the bottom, beneath the careful loops of his signature, was a second name, hers. She looked at it and then at him. "Why now?" "Because the work was never mine alone. Because when you walk into a room, people listen. Because your name deserves to stand where your courage has already walked." Her eyes shimmered, but she did not cry. She had learned to weep in silence, in gardens, in midnight corridors. But this was a moment to be held, not mourned. Later that afternoon, she visited the western edge of the station, where the reading room now stood. It was a modest brick building, the mortar still pale and fresh. Inside, rows of shelves lined the walls. A woman in a dark green dress read aloud to a group of children, her voice calm, her cadence steady. A widower polished the window panes while his daughter set out lemonade for the readers. In the corner, on a table of honey-colored oak, stood a vase with a single pressed magnolia blossom, the same kind Clara had once tucked between her letters. Mercy reached out, her fingertips brushing the edge of the vase, and she smiled. This place was not a monument. It was not a tribute carved in stone. It was living, breathing, built not of sorrow but of action. Behind her, Elias stood in the doorway, watching her with an expression that held no secrets anymore. "Clara would have loved this," he said. "She would have built it herself," Mercy replied. He nodded. "She dreamed it, but you brought it to life." They did not embrace. They did not kiss. But the space between them softened, as if even silence had learned to be tender. Outside, the low rumble of another train vibrated through the air. It was not loud, but it was real, and for the first time, it belonged to them. The late summer evening settled over New Orleans like a warm shawl woven in gold and smoke. The sky stretched wide and soft above the rooftops, streaked with shades of apricot and rose. In the distance, the rhythmic hum of a passing train rolled like a heartbeat across the land, a sound once fraught with loss, now filled with quiet triumph. On the veranda of a modest but dignified house, built of time-worn brick and shaded by ancient magnolias, Mercy sat beside Elias in companionable silence. A gentle breeze stirred the hem of her cotton skirt, lifting it just enough to brush against the toes of her boots. Her hair, pinned simply at the nape, had begun to loosen in the humid air. She made no move to fix it. Before them, children ran across the yard, laughter echoing through the columns. The scent of lemon balm and crushed grass mingled with the faint aroma of coal smoke from the rails beyond the garden. Every detail of the evening felt anchored in something earned, not given, a stillness built from storms that had passed and left strength in their wake. The reading room glowed softly through the windows across the lawn, its lamplight golden and inviting. Inside, the silhouettes of women moved gently between shelves and tables. Some were widows, others were schoolteachers, laundresses or seamstresses, many of them once voiceless, now gathered to read, to teach, to share. Mercy had seen it bloom from a dream into a haven. She had built it stone by stone, story by story, until it no longer felt like Clara's legacy alone, but also her own. Elias sat beside her, one leg crossed over the other, sleeves rolled to the forearms despite the heat. A smudge of ink clung to his right hand from a day spent drafting contracts. His shoulders had softened in recent months, not from weariness, but from relief. A man no longer waiting for the blade to fall. For a long moment, they watched the train disappear beyond the bend in the tracks. Its rhythm faded, leaving behind only the song of cicadas and the faint rustle of children chasing fireflies near the fence. "She's become something," Elias murmured. Mercy followed his gaze to the reading room. "They all have. I meant you." She turned her head, eyes catching the last fire of the sunset. "I was always something, Elias. You just didn't know what." "No," he said softly. "I didn't. But I do now." A long silence unfurled between them, not heavy but sacred, the kind of silence that lives between two people who have stopped asking for proof. "I used to think," Mercy began, her voice almost lost in the wind, "that survival meant disappearing, that to endure was to become smaller, quieter." He looked at her then, with the same gaze he had worn the first time she read Clara's letters aloud by the fire, a look of reverence, not for what she had suffered, but for what she had become in spite of it. "But now?" he asked. "Now I think survival means building, loving, speaking, even when your voice trembles." He reached for her hand, not with urgency, but with certainty. Their fingers met in the middle of the bench, twining without ceremony. "You were never a price to be paid," he said, the words low, slow and deliberate. "You were the part of me that was waiting to live again." Tears did not fall from her eyes, though they shimmered. Instead, she lifted their joined hands and pressed his knuckles to her cheek. A child called from the yard, a girl with ribbons in her braids and a book under one arm. "Mrs. Marchant, will there be poetry tonight?" Mercy smiled. "There's always poetry, Evie. The world is full of it. You just have to sit still long enough to hear it." The child ran off, and Elias laughed under his breath. "You'll have them all writing sonnets before the season turns." "I'd settle for their names spelled correctly." He stood then, walking slowly toward the reading room as lamplight spilled across the lawn. She watched him go, his figure cast long by the sun's last stretch. Before the door closed behind him, he turned once more, just to look at her. She remained seated alone now, but not lonely. Inside the parlor behind her, a pressed magnolia blossom hung framed above a shelf of worn books. It had once rested inside Clara's final letter, a bloom flattened by time, almost colorless now, but still holding the shape of its petals. Mercy had mounted it in Clara's handwriting. "The world must remember tenderness." Outside, a gust of wind lifted the leaves and rattled the rail ties beyond the garden. The sound of iron and honey, steel forged from ruin, and sweetness pulled from bitter earth. It was not the sound of victory, not exactly. It was the sound of something more lasting, the sound of a life rebuilt not in defiance, but in devotion. Mercy leaned her head back, watching the stars blink one by one into the sky. There would be trials again. There would be names spoken behind fans and lies penned in newspapers. There would be storms. But the world was not the same. Because somewhere, at the edge of the track, a woman had spoken first, and a man had listened, and together they had chosen mercy over memory, and love over fear. The year was 1877, and the city had changed. So had they all. New Orleans pulsed with railroads and song, with heat that never quite left the bone, and laughter that came more freely now, even in the face of hardship. It was a city still haunted in places, still uneven in its reckoning, but no longer silent. Along the wide avenue of Marchant Station, brick buildings stood proud where once there had been dust and rot. A plaque on the side of the reading room read, "Founded in Memory and Mercy." Inside, the air still carried the scent of aged paper and wood polish, and voices echoed from every corner. Girls reciting stanzas, boys studying blueprints, women correcting ledgers and leading discussions once forbidden to their sex. The world had not become perfect, but it had become possible. On the steps of the house that Mercy once entered wearing a dress of duty and shame, now stood a child, Clara Ruth Marchant, named not for legacy alone, but for hope reimagined. She was 7 and bold, all knees and elbows and questions. Her brother, James Elias, toddled after her with the stubborn determination of a 3-year-old who believed he could conquer bricks and bees alike. Mercy watched from the garden gate, her hat casting dappled shadow across her face. Lines had formed gently at the corners of her eyes, more from joy than sorrow. But her posture was as proud as ever, her presence a stillness the world seemed to bend around. Elias approached from the station, his coat slung over his shoulder, his hair dusted with grey, and his eyes no less intense than the day they met. If anything, they had grown deeper, less guarded now, more full of wonder. He bent to kiss her cheek. "Clara says you're letting her read poetry that's far too grown for her. She can recite it better than half the committee," Mercy replied with a smirk. "Let her learn early that words are weapons and balm." They walked together toward the veranda, past a trellis overgrown with night-blooming jasmine. The home was larger now, expanded to accommodate their growing family and Mercy's quiet army of projects, but its heart remained the same, a place built not of wealth, but of hard-earned peace. Inside, Reverend Burke's portrait hung beside Clara Marchant's framed sketch, the original design for the reading room. Beneath it, fresh petitions waited to be signed. Mercy's name appeared on the board of directors for the Southern Women's Education Guild. Elias's rail company had merged with two others, forming a network that stretched from Baton Rouge to the Carolina coast. The scandal Simeon Black left behind had long since reached its crescendo. His trial in Baton Rouge ended in disgrace. Though he never served time, his influence far too tangled in old money, his name had become a whisper rather than a threat. He died 3 years ago, alone and bankrupt, in a boarding house where no one visited. Mercy had lit a candle for him anyway. "I don't do it for him," she had told Elias. "I do it so the anger won't rot in me." Her parents had vanished from the city not long after the court's ruling. A letter came once a year from her mother, now quiet, reflective, signed only Agnes. Mercy replied only once, enclosing a photograph of Clara Ruth with a note that read, "She will never be sold." Her sister Beatrice had finished her studies in Pennsylvania and now taught at a girls' school in Mobile. They wrote monthly, sometimes longer letters, sometimes shorter, always sincere. And Elias and Mercy, they had grown old together in the quietest, fiercest way. There had been illnesses, setbacks, dry seasons and floods. At times, they fought like thunderclaps, especially when the world tried to pull them back into the cages they'd fought to leave behind. But love had never left. It sat at the breakfast table when she brushed crumbs from his collar. It curled between them at night when their children were finally asleep. It stood beside her as she opened a new wing of the reading room, this one with music and maps and journals for girls who had never dreamed beyond their father's porch. As the evening rolled in, Elias lifted James Elias onto his shoulders, and Clara Ruth danced barefoot across the yard. Mercy stepped inside one last time. She stopped before the shelf in the parlor, aged now, bowed slightly in the middle. Above it still hung the pressed flower from Clara's letter, encased in glass, its edges brown, but its shape unmarred. Around it were other things now, a train schedule, a pencil drawing of the garden from Clara Ruth's hand, a letter of thanks from a freedwoman who became the city's first black librarian. Mercy traced the frame with her fingers. This had been the story, not of wealth reclaimed, not even of revenge made right, but of tenderness returned to the soil, watered with tears and grown into something too beautiful to name. Outside, the train passed again, slower this time. The sound, after all these years, still echoed like a hymn. Iron and honey, memory and mercy, and love, always love. Every story leaves behind a trace, and this one, woven in silence, courage, and second chances, leaves the fragrance of something deeper than love, forgiveness. Mercy and Elias taught us that redemption does not come with thunder, nor does healing arrive in grand declarations. It lives in the quiet choices, to stay when it's easier to run, to speak when silence is safer, to love someone not for who they were, but for who they are willing to become. This was never just a tale about debts or disgrace. It was about the power of a single voice, rising in a courtroom, walking through a rail yard, whispering hope into a world that had long forgotten how to listen. And now, we want to hear your voice. What moved you most in this story? Did a single look, a word, or a moment linger in your heart? If you reach the end of this journey with us, write the word mercy in the comments, because sometimes the most powerful stories begin with gratitude. If this narrative touched you and you'd like to support the small team behind these timeless romances, consider sending a super thanks her. But if that's not possible, no worries at all. Sharing this video with a friend, and don't leave just yet. There are more tales of forbidden love, quiet heroines, and noble hearts waiting for you. I've added some in the cards right above. Let the next stow with all our heart. Thank you for watching.